Hi, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and joining me, I am delighted to announce, is Anthony Tresca.
I am delighted you're delighted, and hello there.
This is a podcast devoted to thoughtful discussions about that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so very, very excited and thankful to have you join us for our episode over 1974's Black Christmas.
This is the first of our Black Christmases. We're just going to work our way through them all, and I'm terribly excited for that. And I must say that I am in part, my desire to do so stems from the fact that one of the very first horror podcast episodes I listened to was from Faculty of Horror, and it was their episode where they were comparing the two Black Christmases together. And I can't remember now if they were comparing the 74 with the 2006 or with the 2019. I just can't remember. But either way, I remember that was when I realized that first I really was excited about the idea of podcasting, if I could find someone, and then I did. I found Anthony. But also, it just... it actually made me really excited to watch the films and to watch the films in conversation with one another.
So had you seen this original 1974 version?
I had not.
Had you seen any of the Black Christmases before?
Yes, I've seen the 2006 one, which I think might be the worst one of the bunch.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I saw it, and then I was like, ugh, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. And so I'm pretty sure that was the reason that I just decided to hold off on any other versions of Black Christmas, which is admittedly unfair, because you should never go with a, like... you should never go with like the early 2000 remakes of things as your judge of whether or not something is going to be good. But I'm also not always a big fan of 70s horror. I know that that's a very scandalous statement to make, and I realize that I've just more or less, alienated our listeners from my anything I have to say. But I'm just very selective, I've noticed. And I mean, so I'm a big fan of Halloween. I'm a little less of a fan of the first Friday the 13th. And so, yeah, I think that was my hesitation on seeing the original. But, like I said, that Faculty of Horror episode really made me excited, because one of the things they mentioned that I know we're going to talk about is that this film is weirdly progressive in terms of its... Not just in terms of some of the political statements that are clearly being made, but also in terms of just, if we go back to kind of our labels of horror, right? This film is doing things that I don't think other films are going to do. Had you seen any of these before?
I had seen the 2019 Black Christmas that came out, and that was about it. I also... Longtime listeners of the podcast who hate me know that I don't like 70s horror, or at least the two that you just brought up. I don't like Halloween. I don't like Friday the 13th. I don't know. Give me my nightmare. I couldn't wait. I love the 80s. I love the horror of the 80s. The 90s are hit or miss for me. Early 2000s, what a mess. 2010s, yeah, they're pretty good, but... I wasn't particularly excited, I don't think, to watch Black Christmas. However, I'm happy to report I do like this movie from the 70s. This is a great one. I really like it a lot.
It really is a good film, and I would argue that part of the reason is that it is managing to be a little transgressive, to break free of some of the restrictions that are in place in other 70s horror. And, I don't want to ascribe too much to this without, having a lot of evidence to back it up. But I think it's worth thinking about the fact that this is not a U.S. film.
Yeah,
right?
It's a Canadian film.
And let's face it, the Canadians have managed to be a little less repressed than us in some really important ways. They don't have those puritanical roots that are clinging to them that I think lurk in most slasher films, period, let alone slasher films of the 70s.
Yeah, in one review I read, they attributed this larger phenomenon that you're talking about how Canadian films about America reveal truths about America that Americans aren't willing to admit about themselves. So yeah, I think it's a common trend that not only you, but other film reviewers have also noted this phenomenon that occurs.
So I thought that because this film manages to clearly be a slasher film and in every way that's important, but also manages to be an outlier in some ways, that we would return back as our framework to something that we've looked at before in other discussions of slasher films, but that is definitely worth bringing back to this conversation. And that is Carol J. Clover's section on gender in the slasher film. So it's called Her Body Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film. And this is pretty much the essay that everyone turns to when they're looking for issues of gender and issues of how that appears within horror. And she breaks it down really systematically. She says, okay, we're just going to go through all of the elements of the slasher film and talk about the very specific things that appear that connect to this. And so it's everything from the weapon, which she says is, often incredibly phallic, to the victims who are often highly sexualized and therefore have to be punished, to what she calls the terrible place, which we've discussed in an episode before, which she describes as being rather uterine in appearance oftentimes because it's like a tunnel that the final girl has to burst through to escape and be alive. And then of course the final girl herself, which Clover says is an intriguing figure in these films because that's the figure that male audiences have to identify with if they don't want to identify with the male killer. And so as a result, the final girl is not always usually virginal, but she is a little bit more androgynous or a little bit more masculine in terms of, the coded definitions of that, because that way the male audiences, which in the 70s would probably have been primarily the audiences watching these films, would be able to identify with the fact that a character like Laurie, which is an androgynous name, right, in Halloween, can be somebody identifiable.
Yeah, it's all very Freudian.
Oh, absolutely. Which is one of the reasons that I often struggle with some gender scholarship in horror, because a lot of it really does lurk back to Freud, and even when, thank heavens, feminist scholars are saying, okay, let's push against Freud and his creepiness. Anything that kind of starts from Freud is probably not going to be my cup of tea. But what I like about Clover is that if you've seen even 2 or 3 slasher films, you know that what she's talking about is a pattern that exists throughout much of U.S. slasher films.
Yeah, I mean, like Freud himself, not everything that was said is wrong. It just is creepy and weird. Some of it's wrong.
Yes. and I would say, though, that while some of it is definitely wrong with Freud, Clover really hits the nail on the head in that she's talking about a very specific branch of horror pre-sort of evolution, right? So I think we've gotten to the place where we have some great horror films that are beginning to ask us to burst out of
they're playing
these tropes.
They're playing on these tropes. So they're appropriating these tropes into to have a more modern sensibility to them. However, I do think it's pretty interesting that Clover starts with the final girl from Halloween and not the true start of the slasher films, which is Black Christmas, as you were telling me before the podcast.
Yeah, so there is some really interesting scholarship out there where people are saying that, if we're looking for the root of the slasher film, that we really need to look and turn to not Halloween, as many people cite it to be, but Black Christmas. And certainly, chronologically speaking, Black Christmas comes first.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, if we go through the checklist of things that Clover has built, primarily thinking about Halloween onward, a lot of it's going to hold really true to Black Christmas. Talks about is the use of the eye camera, right? The eye lens. So having the killer's POV be what the camera shows us, and we see that throughout the film.
Black Christmas starts with that.
Yes,
it's it's a very similar shot to the opening shot from Halloween.
It is.
The only difference is the one from Halloween obviously had that dumb looking filter over it to do the mask.
Right, and the other difference is that Halloween really limits us to that one moment, where we get a lot of that in Black Christmas. There are other things, obviously. In Black Christmas, some of the characters who get, quote, punished for their transgressions are the ones who slasher films have told us need to die. The people who drink excessively, the people who are highly sexual, the people who sort of flaunt the standards, conventions of how we're supposed to behave. And certainly we have a final girl in Jess.
Jess is a very ambiguous sounding name.
Exactly.
Not explicitly gendered. Although Jess as a character is pretty gendered, as one of her primary struggle the primary thing in which kind of drives her plot along is that she is pregnant and she is going to get an abortion, which is a uniquely kind of like gendered issue.
Yes, and I think, so we're going to circle back to that. I think the other thing that really makes it hard, so to see Jess as a sort of more androgynous or even masculine character, is that Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween has, a little bit more of an angular face. Her hair was relatively short. She, was dressed in a way that wasn't unfeminine, but it wasn't feminine either. But we need to keep in mind that our main leading actress in Black Christmas, the 74 version, is Olivia Hussey, whose 1968 role was Juliet in like one of the most famous versions of Romeo and Juliet, right? So this is who the chances that audiences in 74 had not seen Romeo and Juliet, or had at least not been familiar with it, are really low, right? That was even the standard version of the film that I watched in elementary school, despite the fact there were other versions, right? That's kind of the standard. So you're absolutely correct that from the casting and her appearance, her hair is much longer. She's much more delicate in form. When you take that and you couple it with one of the central components of the story, and that is the fact that she is pregnant, right? That really adds an interesting layer. And it adds a really interesting layer that she's seeking an abortion. Yeah.
I mean, that is it's very, very interesting, because these issues that they were so relevant in 1974, it feels like this may as well have been a movie with a plot line that is really relevant today, because this is still a central issue, which, I mean, I guess just shows how little progress has come since then, which is a little sad, but also it makes it really relevant to even today on a rewatch.
Yes. It makes it very relevant, I think, in terms of the dynamics with her boyfriend, and this idea of, there's that. So there were a couple of scenes that just felt so much like you said, like they could have come out of a script in 2020 and we wouldn't have blinked twice. And that was the boyfriend's insistence that they were going to get married so that she could have the baby. And then also his insistence, well, fine, but I still want the baby, right? Like and so a lot of the discussions about like one's body. And when you think about the fact, and this to me is just sort of mind-boggling, that this film is coming out in 74. Roe v. Wade is 73. So we are talking that this film at the time would have been incredibly scandalous in the U.S. especially. So there's this really interesting way in which Jess is not... She's not androgynous, but she's also not entirely demonstrating what we have defined as traditional feminine qualities, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the plot devices that just drives me bonkers, is the like, when a female character who has said all along that they don't want children, at the end of a series, yes, I'm speaking to you, Big Bang Theory, has a character be like, but no, I actually do want children after all, I just never knew it. You know, and we see that actually a lot in very conservative horror, right? Where at the end, the sort of progressive female ends up having a family that she now has to take care of because, you know, there are children that are unattached or whatever. So anyway, what this film is doing is it's making a character who is simultaneously very feminine, but also, and this is not me saying it, this is traditional standards of like anti-feminine, right? Not anti-feminist, anti-feminine. And so in this way, to go back to Clover, we are still having a final girl that is really complicated. Just not complicated in the way that I think she would say the slasher film traditionally depicts things. And to me, this is what I think it makes it, in part, this film just so good, is because we have this character that I don't think we get otherwise.
Otherwise,
in
are you saying
American,
without, like, you're saying in an American setting,
in an
like
American, yeah, an American horror of that time, maybe in an American horror of today, certainly if it's a slasher film. I just think this film is rather radical in its depiction of Jess and how casually it presents Jess.
Yeah, it's so rational that, like, the position that they paint Peter, the boyfriend, in, is so, like, tyrannical and oppressive and just, like, out of control that it's not even an option. It's just like, well, yeah, obviously gonna side with Jess, because Jess is the only level-headed one here who's thinking clearly at all. Which is, yeah, you're right. It's that kind of depiction probably would not happen today because it doesn't have, it may not have, like, mass market appeal, and so they shy away from that.
Yeah. Hence
why, like, abortion is just a touchy subject in American films in general.
Right. And not only is he tyrannical, I'm glad, thank you for reminding me of his name. So his name is Peter, right? So there's a biblical connotation right there, but he plays church music, right? He is the representative of the church in this way. And so
yeah.
he's the patriarchy, he's the system, he's religion, right? And she kills him, right?
Yeah.
Like, you know, she kills the patriarchy at the end, and that's shocking.
No, it's powerful. And I think we'll circle back to another reason why Jess can't be a true final girl, I don't think, is because in a lot of these slasher films, it's almost like, in spite of their femininity, though these slasher girls are able to overcome everything. But in Black Christmas, Jess really is able to overcome Peter, the patriarchy, the oppression that is based on her because of her femininity.
Can you elaborate on that?
I think I mean, I think it's because it's a very particular position in which she's been placed into, in which she's like women are taught every day to be in fear when they're of people who are going to do these perpetrators who are going to come harass them in this manner, and Jess is living that worst nightmare. And so, but in a way, it's almost as if that upbringing and the socialization puts her in a perfect position to understand and accurately assess the situation. And she understands why the stakes are so high. And so she knows what to do, and she's able to successfully thwart it. It being Peter, the patriarch. I'm using it in a broader sense because of her femininity.
Yeah, so I would agree. I would agree largely with what you're saying. I would say that there's a small wrench thrown into this idea that she does it successfully when we keep in mind that, you know, technically Peter wasn't the killer.
Yeah, Peter may not have been the killer, but Peter was the villain.
That's true.
So I guess it doesn't necessarily... I think that is something that is deeply interesting about this film, is that the murderer is not positioned as the central villain, because I think Peter is definitely the central villain of this film, while the person who is perpetrating all of these murders is quite honestly more of a plot device than anything else.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I do want to circle back to the murder in a little bit, but if I'm going to go real far in my gender analysis here.
Go for it.
Yeah. So if we're going to return back to the idea that Clover raised about the terrible place being a metaphor for, at the very least, the uterine element of the female body, if not more. To speak on what you said about Peter being the villain, he literally breaks into Jess's place. Mm-hmm. Right? He smashes that window and he's like, "Hey Jess, can I come in?" And then and I don't think it takes much to read that as a metaphor for, not that he raped her or anything like that, but that he and patriarchy and the larger hegemonic but particularly male-centric society have long felt that they have the ability to control and to manipulate a woman's body if they think that it's in the best interest of them and or the woman, right? And so he breaks in to, quote, save her. He breaks in to see what's wrong with her. If he's not, a murderer, or wasn't going to murder her, which I think we have to assume that he wasn't, even if he was going to be controlling, he still is terrorizing her. And so, I think that, the fact that we have this violation of her border and her boundary, and in the end, he's the one that has to pay the price for it. So there's a joke, on the internet that says something along the lines of, that every male at the age of 16 should have a vasectomy, and then when they're ready to have children, it can be reversed. And then at the end, it says, "Oh, you don't like the idea of someone making decisions about what your body can do?" And it's, and of course the joke is that we often restrict what women's bodies can do. And I think this film is explicitly exploring all of that in a way that is honestly just shocking for a film of the 70s, for a horror film, for a slasher film. And that makes it a film that I don't think, even as it can be the first film of the slasher films, I'm not sure we can say that it is the first slasher film, because it's too much of an outlier, right? it's
only if you accept that Clover's definition is universal, and because I think then I don't think that it necessarily needs to be. I think that Clover's definition, I think you talked about this earlier, it's referring to a very specific set of slasher films. And so I don't even think it would be right to use Clover's definition to talk broadly about slasher films, or talk about any slasher film or slasher-like films that came before Halloween, or I'm trying to think of where the cutoff point is.
Yeah, so I would say that her description works for films Halloween to probably the end of the 90s.
Yeah, I was thinking the 90s as well.
I think maybe Scream broke the mold, because it sort of became because in its self-awareness, it ended up sort of breaking the mold a little bit.
By putting on display all of the various tropes that are so predominant within this genre that Clover identified, Scream effectively kind of forced you to have to change. It forced it to change a little bit. And so I think that's a good place to... So it's from Halloween to Scream, that's when Clover's talking about. So of course, it wouldn't necessarily include Black Christmas, and Black Christmas might seem an outlier in the slasher genre, because it's an outlier in Clover's sense of the slasher genre from that period.
Well, so I think the reason that I want to hesitate to call it the start of the slasher film, so I want to say that it is... I want to make a distinction between something being the first and being the start of. And I want to say that Black Christmas was probably the first slasher film, but that it is not the start of the slasher film. because I don't think the slasher film as a genre, talking again from Halloween to probably right before Scream, so including things like, you know, I Know What You Did Last Summer, that sort of stuff. I think that those films would have been the richer if Black Christmas had been the start of that subgenre. But because it wasn't, we found ourselves with a entertaining, but ultimately much less robust set of films than we might have gotten if we had all sort of worked from the premise that Black Christmas was the beginning of the mold, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably true, because I think that the specific set of films that Clover is really referring to are all inherently conservative in nature.
Yes.
And Black Christmas couldn't. Obviously, I mean, it wasn't super duper popular. It was nowhere near as successful as Halloween or films like Halloween in terms of just like its monetary return. And I think a large deal of that has to be attributed to the more risque elements and the more, like taboo subject matters that it plays with, that audiences would be, if not in disagreement, at least uncomfortable with.
Yes. And there are two things that I think. So I think it's the taboo element, which we've been talking about. And also I think it's the fact that the film is surprisingly disaffirmative. And I say surprisingly because I'm not sure I can think of any other horror slasher film that is from that period, right, that is disaffirmative. So on the taboo end of things, it's not just the issue with Jess and Peter. It's not just the fact that she murders an innocent person, which again not many other slasher final girls do.
Although is he innocent? I don't know if that's true.
Well, so he's okay, innocent of murdering people in the house. That he is innocent of murdering the people in the house. However, you're right. He is not innocent insofar as nobody who participates in the patriarchy is innocent.
And I mean, I think ironically also too, like the more libertarian conservative people who might be offended by the implications of something like that. Ironically, American law would have Jess be in the right because he is also violating property laws and by breaking and entering, and so American law puts it well within her right to kill someone based on breaking and entering principles. So ironically, both, I think, if you are on the more progressive end of the spectrum, the more left-wing side, you would agree, you might be able to agree that she's in the right because of his transgressions against her and her femininity and his role in the patriarchy. And if you're on the more right-wing side, she's in the right because of property laws, which I just think is very funny.
That's hysterical.
Both of those are there.
Yeah, that's absolutely hysterical. I hadn't even thought about it, but you're absolutely correct. That the only way it could have gotten a little bit more, America was if she, shot him with her, like, Colt rifle. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. So we have those levels of taboo. We also have, I was rather surprised, by the amount of sexual, language that they got into this film. Both the whole, like, running joke about, fellatio, but also, I actually was profoundly disturbed by the killer's phone calls. Some of the sounds that he made were absolutely terrifying, because they felt very unnatural. I think once he started talking and, like, having, mumbling about, things, it became a little less scary. But there were a couple of those early ones when he was saying just a whole bunch of words about female body parts, that he made some, like, squealing, like, noises that were truly just utterly terrifying. So we have that element of the taboo.
Do you want to know how that was all recorded?
Yes, I do.
So it was by the mixing of forks, combs, knives into the strings of pianos to create a kind of warped sound, and then the distortion of this sound further by recording it onto an audio tape and then slowing it down, and then the recording of the voices during a lot of those things would one of the main actors who recorded the voice stood on his head during the recording sessions to compress his thorax and make his voice sound more demented. He spent 3 days recording dialogue for that character and described this experience as being very avant-garde, with the director encouraging him to improvise within the character's voice.
That's amazing. I'm just always so amazed by the creativity of sound mixers and sound designers. And also just the, like, you know, screw it, let's just see what happens, right, approach of some lower budget films. That's fantastic.
So that was, like, the forks, knives, and combs combo was also used to make the score as well. That was mixed with the piano music that accompanied that as well. So it was just, like, very interesting sound design all over the place in this film.
Yeah, and interesting sound design coupled with some really lovely cinematography, and, you know, the acting was pretty nice. I do want to talk about, though, I think the other reason that this film, to me, was such a pleasant surprise is that, as we've talked about many times in our episodes, I truly think that typically speaking, the more interesting horror is disaffirmative, right? And when we lift up the curtain, we realize that we are the problem. And I think that idea is continued beyond Peter. So there is a little bit of the dialogue of the killer that suggests that he has trauma from, like, a mother figure that is a little problematic.
Problematic or just Freudian?
Well,
just weirdly Freudian.
Yeah, so problematic in that it's weirdly Freudian, right? Like,
that's what I thought you meant. I just wanted you to say that.
Thank you. Problematic in that it's grossly Freudian. But one of the things that's really interesting to me is the role of the police officers in this film. And it's interesting because, again, like, I think everything this film does, it refuses to give us quite as clean answers of, you know, is Jess, you know, the quote Madonna figure or the horror figure, and it's like, does it matter? And then it's, you know, are the police saviors or you know, incompetent? And it's like, well, it depends. And so, you know, we have some really incompetent police, but then we also have the main police officer, who the actor would later go on to be in Nightmare.
John Saxton?
Yes, John Saxton would later go on to be in Nightmare on Elm Street and would become another problematically patriarchal police officer figure. But
also a dad in that movie.
Yeah, like literally a dad instead of just a figurative dad. And on the one hand, he seems to be competent. He seems to be investigating things. On the other hand, he's not helpful at all, right? He like in Halloween, this also happens in Halloween, right? The patriarchal figure arrives after the final girl has taken care of, quote, everything. But unlike Halloween, we realize that, like, they're leaving her in the house with the killer.
Yeah.
And that's where we end our film, right? With the realization that our system that has promised to protect us is incompetent on a really fundamental, life-threatening level. And again, that's a really disaffirmative message that is kind of shocking for horror period, but especially for a film that is predominantly about white people and a film that is a slasher film.
Yeah, it does. It says a lot about just, like, the complacency and the inability of people in power, law enforcement, men, to help those who aren't in the dominant paradigm, who don't represent people who fit that exact description of white men. You're absolutely right. It's very deeply progressive in its messaging and very incredibly disaffirmative, very very against the current status quo. I don't know. I think it's just very... You're right. It's very shocking that this is still a film from 1974. These are conversations that we are having today. These are like things that are still being talked about today. I mean, I think from, both the characterization of the police and its relation to how it helps marginalized groups, and then also the Peter as being this kind of more... It relates to a concept that's been going around on the internet as of late, of these like soft boys, and yet how they can still be incredibly toxic, because Peter kind of does take on some more feminine attributes. He is a patron of the arts who is going to play music, which is a more feminine, typically gendered as a feminine trait. He wears feminine style of clothing. He wants a family and to settle down, and have these children, which are typically gendered as being female things, and yet he is still a symbol of the patriarchy. His femininity and his perceived femininity is not enough to negate the fact that he still has a lot of privilege and power, and abuses that power that he gets from the patriarchy.
And I would argue that maybe one area where the film not falls, but maybe stumbles slightly is in the idea that it is in the ways in which he is more, quote, feminine, that cause us to be alarmed by him. Right? So it's when he becomes more emotional. It's when he becomes needy. It's when he refuses to to back down on and listen to reason, right?
Yeah.
That he becomes perceived as the threat, and it's in those moments that the film is asking us to question whether or not he's the killer, right? Because of course we don't know for sure if he's the killer throughout most of the film. It doesn't make sense timeline wise, but we're willing to suspend our disbelief. And so it is a little problematic that what makes him dangerous, right, or what makes him a perceivable threat, is the fact that he's not acting like the quote good qualities of masculinity, right? That he's acting, quote, feminine. And I don't know what the film could have done to resolve that. Certainly it would have taken another about 15 or 20 minutes of plot. But that is maybe the one place that the film stumbles a little.
Yeah, which is interesting. It's an interesting... I don't even know if I would necessarily describe it as an outright stumble, just more of a kind of interesting commentary on what we perceive as being gendered, and it's weird that those things would then be associated with bad. So maybe it's like a call to to the audience to maybe you should re-examine why you read femininity on this character as bad.
Yeah, I don't know if the film has the ability to quite make us question that. I don't think it quite goes that far. I think it would need something more in order for us to do that. So maybe an exploration where we have to really question whether Jess was in the right to kill him. Whereas I don't think the film makes us feel at all bad that he's died. So and like you said, the film very clearly makes it known that he is the killer, right? Or not killer, that he is the...
He's not the killer.
I'm sorry. The film makes it really clear that he is the villain. And so I'm not sure that it quite does what it would need to do to turn this into an ask on us, the audience, to consider it. Certainly not the audience of 74. Maybe the audience of today. But I just think that that's yet another really fascinating layer to this film that makes it just surprisingly worth engaging with.
I mean, I think whether or not it's necessarily what they specifically intended, it's certainly a way to read the film, and one that I don't know if necessarily, as you're framing it as like a problem, I don't know if it necessarily rectifies this problem, but it certainly adds an interesting layer of the discussion that can be had.
One of the things we haven't talked about, but that I know both of us very much enjoyed, is the fact that this is definitely not a horror comedy in the same way that some other horror comedies are that we've talked about. Right? This is not like a la Shaun of the Dead, where it's comedy with some horror. But this is a funny film. So that it's almost, it's like it's a horror dark comedy, right? If
a horror black comedy.
Yes. I mean, and it really is. And I think, there's a lot of very amusing parts that happen throughout. What were some of the ones that struck you as being worth sort of thinking about further?
I think a lot of it, what I find just absolutely fascinating, is a lot of the humor that's able to come out of the setting and the setting of the sorority house, and a lot of the humor that stems from these characters. And I think it's not always necessarily even like behavior that you typically would associate with people who are in a sorority. Like, I think Barb is an absolutely deeply hilarious and fascinating character, and is not necessarily someone who you typically would think of when the stereotype of like a sorority girl comes to mind. And I think that's another thing that is very excellent about this film, is all of the characters in the sorority house and people who interact with the members from the sorority house are forced to like kind of come to terms with the fact that maybe these stereotypes and everything isn't exactly true. And so this comedy that comes from that is often from like a mishmash of like people's perceptions with the actual performance of people who are in these situations. And I just find that, and I think it's also not only the people who have to interact with the characters who are in the sorority, but also the audience and their perception of people who are in sororities, and the just mishmash of what actually happens in the film versus what the expectation is.
I think you can see a lot of what will end up becoming source material, and I'm not saying that this was a source of inspiration, but I think there's a lot of ways in which the humor in this film we will see eventually in National Lampoon's 1978 Animal House, which is all about, fraternities, and it's all about some of the like raunchiness of it and the like quirky oddball characters, and the fact that like we all have this idea that fraternities and sororities produce these sort of carbon copy individuals, and yet what makes them such a weird place is that they are often filled with people that are so diverse, right, but are somehow linked together in this house. And so there's little moments like when the house mother realizes that there's some obscene items around the house, right, and is like trying to casually cover them up while she's talking to the dad of the first girl who disappears. I also think that the Christmas element, this film did a good job of making it so that it was relevant and that it's at Christmas time, like it fit into the story without it feeling forced. So one of the jokes that I thought, it was a really small moment, but when the children are like doing the Christmas carols, and then one of the supervisors comes up and she's like, we need to leave now, and they're like, why? So just like all these little things of like, in a time when all of us sort of willingly suspend our belief in like stranger danger and, needing to be accountable and like not, boozing it up. Like, Christmas is it's a lawless time, right? Like it is a true like period of carnival as defined by, Bakhtin, and this film reveals that in really clever and funny ways. In case you are sad that our episode is about to end, there is no need to be, because we are going to keep giving you Black Christmas for the next little while. So our next episode is going to be on
the 2006 adaptation of Black Christmas. This is one you've seen, I've not seen, so it'll be the first time for me to watch it. But it'll be interesting to hear about how the film has evolved in your mind since you saw it.
Well, considering that I don't remember it at all, the answer is significantly. No, I don't remember this film at all. I know I've seen it because I know I've seen one of the Black Christmases, and I haven't seen the 2019 or the 74 prior to this. So right. By default, but that is the extent of my of my recalling. So I too am very excited to see what my thoughts are after watching this film. In the meantime,
yeah, be sure to give us a like and share us. Be sure to follow us on social media. And as always, if you want to just recommend us to your friends, we'd always love to have new listeners here. And you can feel free to reach out to us if you have any suggestions for future episodes. Let us know what you like and what you want to see more of in the future. As always, thank you for listening.